This is the story of the American Revolutionary War, the epic struggle between 230,000 Patriots and 56,000 British soldiers. At its heart stands General George Washington, leading a nation not yet born. Beside him, Thomas Jefferson, the pen of liberty, Benjamin Franklin, the voice of wisdom, and Alexander Hamilton, the mind of revolution. From the frozen fields of Valley Forge to the victory at Yorktown, this war would not only win independence, it would create the United States of America. The spring dawn broke quietly over the village of Lexington, Massachusetts. Mist still clung to the fields when the rhythmic pounding of hooves echoed through the lanes. Paul Revere's voice sliced through the silence. "The British are coming! The British are coming!" Doors swung open. Sleepy eyes met the trembling firelight of lanterns. Men who were farmers an hour ago now grabbed muskets and powder horns. In the small meeting hall, Captain John Parker stood tall before his men, his face carved with calm resolve. "Stand your ground," he said. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." His wife, Mary, watched from their doorway, clutching her shawl. She whispered a prayer. The faint smell of baking bread mingled with gunpowder, a strange blend of life and death. In Boston, General Thomas Gage had sent 700 redcoats to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord. To him, it was a simple mission of control. To the colonies, it was a provocation, the spark that would ignite rebellion. The sound of drums grew louder as redcoats marched into Lexington Green. Morning birds fluttered away as rows of bright scarlet coats faced the trembling but determined farmers. For a heartbeat, both sides waited. Then a shot no one knew who fired first cracked the air like a lightning bolt. Smoke erupted. Men screamed. When the firing ceased, 8 patriots lay dead. Mary ran forward, her hands trembling, finding her husband kneeling beside a fallen friend. Parker's voice was hoarse. "We will not be slaves. Not now, not ever." Hours later, the British reached Concord's North Bridge, but this time, hundreds of militiamen awaited them. The colonists returned fire, forcing the redcoats to retreat all the way back to Boston under constant attack from behind fences and trees. The countryside blazed with fury and resolve. By evening, 4,000 militiamen surrounded Boston. The revolution had begun, not in Parliament or palaces, but on the muddy roads of Massachusetts. That night, Samuel Adams wrote in his journal, "What began as the defense of rights has become the struggle for a nation yet unborn." The bell of independence had not yet rung, but its echo was already felt, a promise carried in the smoky wind. The city of Boston lay trapped like a bird in a cage. British cannons overlooked the harbor, and their ships ruled the sea, but beyond the city's limits, the Continental Army grew larger each day. In June 1775, George Washington, tall and solemn, rode into Cambridge, Massachusetts. The soldiers saluted as he passed, a mix of farmers, blacksmiths, and young men still learning to hold their muskets straight. Their uniforms were mismatched, but their hearts burned with one purpose: freedom. Washington dismounted and addressed them. "We fight not as rebels, but as free men who will not bow." From that day, discipline began to replace chaos. Barracks were built, drills were ordered, and a new sense of unity took root. Meanwhile, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams, in Philadelphia, "The flame of liberty burns in every heart. Do not forget the ladies, for we too share the burden of this fight." Winter bit hard. Supplies were short. Yet, Henry Knox, a man of great will, volunteered for an impossible task: to haul 60 tons of captured artillery from Fort Ticonderoga in New York over frozen rivers and mountains, all the way to Boston. For weeks, men and oxen trudged through snowstorms. Frozen ropes snapped, sleds broke, but Knox pressed on. "These guns will change the course of war," he declared. In March 1776, Washington's army positioned the heavy cannons atop Dorchester Heights, overlooking the British fleet. When dawn revealed the sight, General Gage stared through his spyglass in disbelief. American guns now towered above the harbor. He muttered, "The damned rebels have outfoxed us." The British had no choice. Within days, they evacuated Boston, ships sailing for Halifax. Church bells rang across New England. Washington, standing atop the heights, removed his hat in silent pride. A farmer nearby whispered, "We have done the impossible." But Washington's gaze was distant. He knew the war was far from over. The victory in Boston was only the beginning, a prelude to an even greater storm gathering in the South. The world watched. The colonies had proven they could stand against an empire. The summer of 1776 hung heavy over Philadelphia. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, a small group of men debated the fate of a continent. The wooden shutters were drawn to keep out the heat and, perhaps, to keep their voices from drifting into the streets. Thomas Jefferson, only 33, sat by a candle, quill in hand. His desk was cluttered with parchment, drafts, and ink stains. John Adams paced behind him, his voice firm yet anxious. "This must be bold, Thomas. The world must see our cause is just, not reckless." Jefferson nodded. "Then let the words breathe freedom." At another table, Benjamin Franklin chuckled softly. "Gentlemen, we must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." The room erupted in brief laughter, thin and nervous, like the calm before a storm. Days turned into nights as Jefferson penned the immortal words. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Outside, the streets buzzed with whispers of rebellion. Women like Abigail Adams stitched flags and wrote letters urging courage and remembrance. "The flame we kindle must never die," she wrote to John. On July 2nd, the Continental Congress voted for independence. On July 4th, they approved Jefferson's declaration. John Hancock, standing tall at the front, dipped his quill into the ink and signed his name in large, bold strokes. "There," he said, smiling so that King George can read it without his spectacles. One by one, the delegates came forward. The silence of their signatures was louder than any musket fire. When the final parchment was sealed, a bell rang through Philadelphia. People poured into the streets, cheering and weeping. A young voice shouted, "We are free." But Franklin leaned toward Adams and said quietly, "Now, sir, we must make these words true." That night, Jefferson stood on the balcony of his lodging, gazing at the stars. He could still hear the echo of the bell, and in it, the heartbeat of a new nation. Yet, he also knew that freedom, once declared, must be defended in blood and sacrifice. The colonies were no longer subjects. They were Americans. And the world would never be the same again. Barely a month after declaring independence, the young nation faced its first great test. The British returned this time, not with a few regiments, but with the largest armada the world had ever seen. New York Harbor glimmered with more than 400 ships, their masts crowding the skyline like a forest of iron and sails. Over 30,000 British and Hessian soldiers prepared to crush the rebellion in one swift blow. General Washington stood atop Brooklyn Heights, watching through his spyglass. His expression was grave. "They mean to end us here," he murmured to Greene. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 4-1, but retreat meant surrender. "We hold," Washington said firmly. On August 27, 1776, the Battle of Long Island began. Thick fog rolled over the marshes as British troops flanked the American lines under General Howe. Muskets roared, cannonballs screamed through the trees. Benjamin Talmadge, then a young officer, shouted orders as soldiers scattered. Smoke choked the air. "Hold the line," cried Mifflin, but the British surrounded them from behind. Washington's heart pounded as he saw his army faltering. He refused to abandon his men. "If I must fall," he declared, "let it be with my soldiers." Night fell, bringing a desperate plan. Trapped with the East River at their back, Washington ordered a silent evacuation. Over the course of the night, under thick fog and divine luck, his entire army, over 9,000 men, escaped across the river to Manhattan. Not a single man was lost. As dawn broke, the British realized their prey had vanished. Washington, exhausted and mud-stained, looked back from the boat. "Providence has not abandoned us," he whispered. For now, the revolution lived on. In the following days, British troops occupied New York. The city burned, its skyline filled with black smoke. But among the ruins, the spirit of freedom endured, wounded, but unbroken. The Declaration had been tested in fire, and the dream of independence refused to die. The winter wind howled through the bare trees of Pennsylvania. The Continental Army, ragged and starving, camped on the western bank of the Delaware River. Defeat after defeat had crushed morale, enlistments were ending, the dream of liberty seemed frozen in the snow. Yet George Washington refused to yield. Standing by the dim light of a lantern, he unfolded a letter from Congress urging him to hold the line. He looked up at his weary officers, men whose boots were torn, whose eyes had seen too much. "Gentlemen," Washington said quietly, "we will not end the year in despair. We cross tonight." The plan was audacious. Cross the icy river under cover of darkness, march 9 miles, and attack the Hessian outpost at Trenton by dawn. Victory was their only hope. John Glover and his Marblehead fishermen manned the boats, breaking through floating ice with oars and poles. The freezing wind lashed against their faces, the river groaned under sheets of ice. James Monroe, just 19, clutched his musket and whispered a prayer. "If we fail, sir?" he asked. Washington's voice was calm but steely. "Then we fail, free men." Through the storm, they crossed, 2,400 men, horses, and cannon, silently and without the British knowing. At 4 a.m., they began their march toward Trenton, snow crunching beneath their boots. As dawn rose on December 26, 1776, the attack began. Hamilton's artillery thundered through the narrow streets. "Advance!" Washington shouted, riding forward through the smoke, sword raised high. The Hessians, caught off guard after their Christmas feast, scrambled to fight back. General Rall tried to rally his men, but fell mortally wounded. Within an hour, the town was taken. "Victory!" cried Hamilton, tears of relief freezing on his cheeks. Washington looked across the river valley, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and triumph. "This day," he said softly, "will give new life to our cause." News of the victory swept across the colonies. Men re-enlisted, the people rejoiced, and hope returned. For the first time, it seemed possible the revolution might survive. In the snow-covered streets of Trenton, the flag of the United States waved proudly for the first time after a long season of loss. By 1777, the war raged across the colonies. The British sought to split America in two by seizing New York and the Hudson River. But in the north, a stubborn American army prepared to meet them. Under General Horatio Gates, American forces faced General Burgoyne's British Army near Saratoga, New York. Among Gates's officers was a fiery, impulsive man, Benedict Arnold, whose courage burned like a storm. For days, the forests echoed with musket fire and cannon blasts. Arnold charged again and again, rallying the troops as bullets tore through his coat. "Come on, men," he shouted, leading the assault that broke the British line. Burgoyne's army, cut off and surrounded, finally surrendered. It was October 17, 1777, a day that would change everything. When news reached Europe, France saw that the American cause might succeed. Soon, they pledged formal alliance, sending ships, soldiers, and gold. The revolution was no longer a colonial rebellion, it had become an international war for liberty. Yet, even as France celebrated, Washington's army suffered a bitter winter at Valley Forge. Snow blanketed the hills of Pennsylvania as thousands of soldiers starved, shivered, and died of disease. Washington walked among them each day, silent but present, sharing their hunger, their cold, their prayers. "Hold fast," he told them. "Spring will come." It was during these dark months that hope arrived in the form of Baron von Steuben, a stern Prussian officer with a booming voice and a heart for discipline. He drilled the men tirelessly, teaching them the art of war. Again, he barked in heavy German-accented English. "You fight for freedom, fight like soldiers." Lafayette, the young French nobleman, became like a son to Washington. Together, they watched the men transform, ragged farmers into a real army. By spring of 1778, the soldiers marched with new strength and pride. Their muskets gleamed, their steps synchronized. Washington stood before them, tears shining in his eyes. "We have suffered, and we have endured," he said. "Now we are ready." The British had the numbers, the ships, the empire. But America now had something stronger: unity, discipline, and the faith of nations. The tide had turned. The revolution lived, and the world was watching. By 1781, the war had dragged on for 6 long, bleeding years. Cities burned, families were torn apart, and soldiers marched barefoot across continents for a dream that still lived only in the hearts of a few. In the South, General Cornwallis, proud and relentless, had marched his British army into Yorktown, Virginia, intending to secure the coastline. He believed the British Navy would protect him. But fate and strategy had other plans. In the North, George Washington sat in his headquarters near the Hudson River, studying a map lit by candlelight. "Cornwallis thinks we will attack New York," he said to Rochambeau, the French general beside him. "Then let us make him believe it while we march to Virginia." The two commanders clasped hands. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse would sail north to blockade the Chesapeake Bay, trapping the British by sea. Meanwhile, Washington's and Rochambeau's combined armies, nearly 17,000 strong, would strike from the land. The march began. For 14 days, soldiers and cannons rumbled south across dusty roads, through rain and heat. Farmers cheered them, ringing church bells and waving flags. The dream of victory was alive again. In early October, they surrounded Yorktown. The French fleet sealed off the harbor. No British reinforcements could arrive. Cornwallis, trapped, fortified his defenses and waited. Washington stood beside Lafayette, gazing through a spyglass. "This is the hour we have prayed for," he said. The siege began on October 9, 1781. Cannons thundered day and night. Hamilton, now commanding a light infantry battalion, led a daring night assault on British redoubts, small fortifications guarding the town. "Men of valor," Hamilton shouted, "the world is watching, forward." They charged through the smoke and darkness, bayonets flashing. Within minutes, the redoubt was taken. Lafayette raised the American flag atop the captured walls. Days later, Cornwallis's position crumbled under relentless bombardment. The ground shook, and his soldiers could no longer stand the fury of combined American and French fire. On October 19, 1781, under a pale sky, British drums beat the tune of surrender. Cornwallis, too humiliated to attend, sent his second-in-command to hand over the sword. Washington received it in silence. He looked across the fields littered with smoke, tears, and flags. Then, quietly, he said, "The war is over." The American soldiers cheered. French drums rolled. Men embraced and wept openly. For the first time, the world bowed to a new power, not an empire of kings, but a republic of free men. Lafayette smiled through tears. "My dear general," he said, "you have secured the liberty of 2 worlds." Washington placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," he replied softly. "The people have done this. May they keep it." The road to Yorktown had been paved with sacrifice, but at its end stood freedom, fragile, beautiful, and eternal. In the grand halls of Paris, chandeliers flickered above tables of maps and treaties. It was 1783, and after 8 long years of war, the nations of the world gathered to recognize what had once seemed impossible. At the head of the American delegation sat Benjamin Franklin, now old, wise, and weary. His spectacles glinted as he studied the parchment before him, the Treaty of Paris. Beside him, John Adams leaned forward. "We have won the land," he said quietly. "Now we must prove worthy of it." John Jay, ever the realist, added, "Nations will test us. Our unity will be our true defense." Across the table, the British representatives looked solemn. Even in defeat, they carried the dignity of empire. The document was signed with a flourish, and with it came history's turning page. The United States of America was officially recognized independent and free. Franklin exhaled deeply. "Gentlemen," he said with a faint smile, "we must all be thankful, and most of all, industrious." Back home, the word spread like wildfire. Church bells rang from Boston to Charleston. Farmers stopped their plows and knelt in the fields. Mothers wept, children cheered. In New York City, the last British troops boarded their ships and sailed away as American flags rose above the harbor. Crowds filled the streets, waving hats and shouting, "Long live Washington!" But Washington himself stood apart from the noise. At Fraunces Tavern, surrounded by his officers, he raised a glass in farewell. His voice trembled slightly. "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I commend your faith, your patience, and your valor. Having completed the work assigned to us, I retire from the great theater of war." Tears filled the room. Hardened soldiers embraced their commander one last time. Washington then returned to his farm at Mount Vernon, seeking peace in the simple rhythm of the land. The plow replaced the sword. The dream of liberty now lived in the soil of a free nation. In London, King George III asked an aide, "What will Washington do now?" When told he had gone home instead of seizing power, the king paused, amazed. "If that is true," he said, "then he is the greatest man in the world." Thus ended the war that began with farmers on a village green. The British Empire had lost a colony, and the world had gained a republic. A new nation had been born, not through conquest, but through conviction. And across the ocean, the winds of freedom began to whisper in other lands, echoing the promise that all men are created equal. For years after the war's end, the young nation stood at a crossroads. Independence had been won, but unity was crumbling. The Articles of Confederation, America's first system of government, had left the states weakly bound, struggling with debt, disputes, and unrest. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered once again in Philadelphia, the same city where independence had been declared. The air was thick with heat and tension as men in powdered wigs and worn coats debated the soul of the new republic. At the front of the hall sat George Washington, elected unanimously to preside. His calm presence reminded them of what they had achieved and what was still at stake. James Madison, slight and studious, rose to speak. "We have liberty," he said, "but not order. Let us frame a government that secures both." Alexander Hamilton countered, his voice sharp and passionate. "Without strength, we are a rope of sand. We must have a nation that can stand among empires." George Mason, however, warned, "Power unchecked becomes tyranny. The people must remain the guardians of their own liberty." The days stretched into weeks. Windows were nailed shut to keep discussions private. Sweat dripped from brows as arguments filled the chamber about representation, slavery, and the balance between freedom and authority. One afternoon, Benjamin Franklin, now 81 and frail, rose slowly to his feet. The room fell silent. "Gentlemen," he began, the sun painted on the back of the president's chair. "I have often looked at it without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now I know it is a rising sun." His words softened tempers and reminded them of their shared purpose. At last, on September 17, 1787, the delegates gathered to sign the United States Constitution, a new covenant between the people and their government. Washington watched as each man approached the document. The quills scratched slowly across parchment, binding together 13 states into one union. When it was done, Franklin whispered to Madison, "We have given the people a republic if they can keep it." Outside, bells rang again, echoing those of 1776. Crowds filled the streets, uncertain but hopeful. They had not merely won independence, they had learned how to govern it. The Constitution would go on to endure revolutions, wars, and centuries of change, but that summer in Philadelphia, it was only a promise. A fragile, shining promise born from courage and compromise. And in that moment, America began its second birth, the birth of its ideals. In 1789, on a bright April morning, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. The streets below were filled with cheering citizens, waving flags and tossing flowers. As he placed his hand on the Bible and swore the oath of office, the dream that had begun in the smoke of Lexington Green became reality. The revolution had not only created a nation, it had created a principle. "So help me God," he said softly, and kissed the Bible. Church bells rang. Cannons fired. A new era began, not of kings or conquerors, but of laws and citizens. Thomas Jefferson, writing from Virginia, reflected, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the spirit of its people." The republic grew. It stumbled and rose again through trials, wars, and the testing of its own ideals. Abraham Lincoln, nearly a century later, would call it a new birth of freedom. From the fields of Gettysburg to the beaches of Normandy, from the marches of Selma to the quiet triumphs of innovation and science, the echo of 1776 lived on. The voices of those early patriots, farmers, teachers, mothers, and soldiers never truly faded. Their courage became the heartbeat of a nation that would go on to inspire billions across the world. The narrator's voice rises, calm yet powerful. The American Revolution was not the end of a struggle, it was the beginning of an idea. That all men are created equal. That liberty is not granted, it is earned, defended, and shared. The screen fades through images of time, Washington's farewell, Lincoln's resolve, Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, the waving flags on the moon, and the reflections of children in classroom windows. In every age, the question remains the same. Can we keep the republic? The story closes on a field of waving grass and sunlight breaking over the Potomac River. A single flag rises slowly into the wind. The same wind that once carried the words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The music swells, proud, haunting, eternal. The revolution never ended, it simply became America.